All right. So we will begin. So greetings to all, and thank you all for being here today. Welcome to the 2021 edition of the Reva and David Logan Symposium on the Artist Book. I think maybe I know all of you, but I know at least most of you here today. In case you don't know me, my name is Steve Woodall, and I organize these events in my capacity as collections specialist for artists' books at the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, which is the home for works on paper for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And it has been 2 very long years since the last time we gathered here in this auditorium for an in-person symposium. So it's great to see all your faces here, at least the top halves of your faces. And of course, we are only able to be here in person because of the San Francisco strict masking policy and mandate. So though the speakers have the option of being unmasked and distanced from you while they are speaking, we do have to ask everyone, including the speakers when they are not here at the podium, to remain fully masked for the duration of the program. This year, for the first time in an in-person Logan Symposium, we are able to simultaneously stream this program online. So we have to extend a greeting also to all of you out there in internet land, including many friends in faraway places. Those of you who are here today are our live studio audience for our broadcast. So welcome to people online, whether you're watching this in real time or at a later time. As always, we begin the program with an expression of gratitude to our funders. Above all, to the late Reva and David Logan of Chicago, who in 1998 donated an important collection of 20th century artist books to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. The Logan family has continued their support of the collection through 3 foundations led by their 3 sons. Dan Logan's Revata Foundation, which has lent critical support to our programs this year. Dan, as much as anybody, has made today's program possible. The Reva and David Logan Foundation in Chicago, led now by Richard Logan. The Chicago Foundation supported the first 3 years of our work here beginning in 2016 through 2018. And above all, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation here in the Bay Area. Jonathan has led support for our programming around the collection throughout my tenure here, which began in 2016. John is at home today, recovering from back surgery. So for the first time, he couldn't be here in person, but I know he's watching online, and all of us at the Achenbach Foundation are wishing him a strong and speedy recovery. I would like to welcome our VIP guest, Teresa Boylan from the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, who is here with us today. Those are the foundation logos. Let's go back and look at those. Foundations. Besides this annual symposium in support of my work curating the Logan Gallery of Illustrated Books, the foundations have supported the creation of 3 extensive media-rich websites that highlight books from the collection. La Prose du Transsibérien, about the community of artists, poets, and gallerists in Paris that launched a 20th century art form. The book is Art, an overview of the development of that art form, and most recently, Iliazd Publishing as an art form, devoted to arguably the greatest book artist of the 20th century, Ilya Stanevich. You can find the sites here at insights.famsf.org. 2 years ago, in our last in-person meeting for this symposium, we looked at a question we often hear. What is an artist's book? People want to define it. How do you define an artist's book? Well, one response to that question is that we've really always known what artist books are from the first books that were read to us as children. We were maybe 2 years old when we stepped inside our first artist book. Children's books typically merge an incantatory text, sometimes minimal, sometimes more extensive, with a visual environment created by an artist. And for adults, it is fundamentally no different. The power of the artist book is the synergetic power of words with images, the power to enchant and inspire, to take us inside an environment made of words and images. So this is an artist book, by my definition, as is this, and this. And I'm glad Ward Shoemaker is here today, so you can see his book. When we speak of bridges and social engagement, that can mean collaboration in the making of a book. Dana will talk about that. Or the places books can take us to, or the changes books might make in the way we look at others, because books are agents of change. I hope you will see the exhibition of Enrique Gioia's books in the Logan Gallery today, if you haven't seen it already. And I want to point out a terrific essay that Enrique wrote about his books that appears on the website for the exhibition, the web page within the Legion's website. You have to scroll down to the bottom to find that essay, but it is well worth searching for. And I want to tell a story, briefly tell a story he tells in that essay, because it so perfectly captures an idea behind this year's symposium. Enrique discusses a book he made that takes on things like hypocrisy, homophobia, and just plain wrong thinking. Things he saw in some conservative religious institutions that aggressively politicized their faith. And of course, he did this in his characteristic lampooning style that makes his work both meaningful and at the same time entertaining. While on exhibition at a museum in Loveland, Colorado, the book came under vicious attack on Fox News and other right-wing media. A woman truck driver was inspired to drive her 18-wheeler down from Montana to destroy the notorious book with a crowbar. That actually happened. This is the website, and that's the remains of the book. The incident was widely reported, and the book continued to be reviled by conservatives, but a local pastor unexpectedly came to Enrique's defense. And now the pastor, as well as Enrique, was receiving hate mail and even death threats. The pastor lost part of his congregation. In gratitude for this religious leader's courage, and though Enrique doesn't really consider himself a religious person, he created a large painting for the church that symbolized Christ not as an inspirer of hate and violence, but as an embodiment of love, compassion, and enlightenment. The church members loved the painting and invited him to appear for a dedication ceremony in his honor. And in spite of the death threats he had received, and though he was quite understandably terrified to go back there, Enrique did decide to attend the ceremony, to, as he put it, to accept the consequences of making my art. He was received by the congregation with open arms. They gave him a standing ovation at the ceremony. Enrique calls it one of the most beautiful experiences of his career, and goes on to say this. This is a little too long to put on the screen, but I'll read it. "I learned a couple of formative lessons from this experience," he says. "Art appreciation is deeply affected by context. What is accepted in one place and time may be subversive in another. Perhaps more importantly, I realized that art by itself may not change the world, but it is a door to walk into unknown territories and create honest dialogues with very different and often opposing constituencies that can only help change the world for the better." And I think that's a great way to look at the title and the idea behind this symposium. So we're happy you can join us today, and I hope online tomorrow, to share the experience of artists who, like Enrique, have walked through doors and crossed bridges to explore the vast potential of art, and in this case, books as art, as passages to understanding, and perhaps, dare I say it, even to the realization of our best selves. I'm certainly no more religious than Enrique, I guess, but he's a persuasive evangelist for the power of art. And I've always considered myself an evangelist for the book as an art form. So thanks for hearing this sermon. And in that spirit of love and maybe even altruism, I want to say that I love our speakers this year. I mean, I always do, but this year, I don't know, somehow it seems special. So with a few ground rules set and a little more information, I'll introduce our keynote speaker today. And we will address questions in our discussion period at the end of tomorrow's symposium online, which you will also be able to view at your leisure because it will be immediately posted to YouTube if you have plans tomorrow afternoon. You will also be able to submit questions for today's speaker through the YouTube feed in tomorrow's event, or today's event for that matter, if you're watching online. And speaking of which, we have two great speakers tomorrow, Clifton Metter and Laura Anderson Barbada. I'm supposed to pronounce it Lauda. She is from Mexico, and that's apparently the way they pronounce that name in Mexico, Lauda and Anderson Barbada. Both of them have amazing stories to tell. You really won't want to miss it. So if you can't be live tomorrow, at least check it out. The incantatory text I mentioned earlier in children's books can also be the incantatory text of poetry, of language as art, and in its most ancient form through the music of the human voice. Our keynote speaker, poet Dana Gioia, is trained in music and has written opera librettos. So he deeply understands the power of music and poetry, but he also understands and has been remarkably invested in the power of beautifully printed text on the page, having worked with many of our greatest letterpress printers of poetry. Gioia is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Interrogations at Noon, 2001, which received the American Book Award, and 99 poems, new and selected, 2016, which won the Poets Prize. His critical collections include Can Poetry Matter, 1992, which was a finalist for the prestigious National Book Critics Award. He has written 4 opera libretti and edited 20 literary anthologies. Gioia was born in Los Angeles in 1950, the son of a Sicilian father and a Mexican-American mother. He was the first person in his family to attend college, and he did pretty well. He attended Stanford as an undergraduate and Harvard as a doctoral student in comparative literature, before leaving to obtain an MBA at Stanford Business School. For 15 years, he worked in business in New York before quitting in 1992 to become a full-time writer. Gioia is the former Poet Laureate of California, and he serves in Washington, D.C. as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2009. For 9 years, Gioia was the Judge Widney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at the University of Southern California. He divides his time between Los Angeles and Sonoma County, so reading his biography just, I think, leaves me with a massive inferiority complex. Please welcome a great champion of poetry and books and a great American poet, Dana Gioia.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be in this theater, which I associate with evenings and afternoons of pleasure, watching Donald Pippin's pocket opera. One of my favorite things about San Francisco. I think today I come and speak to you not as a poet, not as a champion of funding the arts, not even as a model in terms of an artistic career, but an example of one kind of life that is possible. When Steve asked me to do this talk, I sort of said, well, yes, I've done lots and lots of collaborations with musicians and with book artists, and so I knew what to show you. What I wasn't sure is how to make sense of it, because sometimes it doesn't even make sense to me. And so I thought about how I would talk about it. Then last night at midnight, I realized I was entirely wrong. And it seemed to me that the only way I could introduce this is by saying, generally, I've lived my life as an artist by different rules than seem to be conventional. The first realization I had fairly early on was that to lead a creative life means that you have to create your life, and you have to constantly revise it, because usually the life you're given is not the life that you want or that you long for. Secondly, one of the great rewards for me of leading an artistic life has been having friends who are artists, people who share my values and visions, not in a partisan way or an ideological way, but in an attitude of openness toward life. In fact, I don't think I would be exaggerating to say that absolutely everyone in this audience, like me, is weird. You wouldn't be here this afternoon if you shared the general values of the society around you. You put value on other things, and have other goals. And that led to a kind of a third instinct, I don't know if you could call it a principle, is that I've always sought community and not institutions. I never had the notion that I would, in a sense, find my community by finding a job. And as someone who's taught in an English department, I can assure you that most English departments are not communities of scholars and artists. They're institutional gatherings of people who are doing jobs. There'll be some people whom you have a deep affinity for, and other people whom you don't. And it comes out of a fourth principle, which is, I honestly believe this is so fundamental, that we need to help create the society we want to live in. People, are always complaining about society because there's much to complain about. But it seems to me that the most important instinct is in whatever sphere of activity you're in, if you see a problem, to do something to help ameliorate it. Perhaps you can't solve it, but you can probably, in a sense, make it better. And then finally, I realized my fifth kind of instinct was not to be afraid to be different. I knew I would never be any good at trying to be like everyone else, because I wasn't like everyone else. All I could try to do is to figure out who I was and what would be the best version of that odd person. So this, leads me to my first contemplation here. Let's see, I think is this. So this is one image of the poet. On a good day, I feel like this. But generally, it also comes out of, if you're going to be a poet, if you're going to be an artist of any kind, most of your life will be solitary, because creation tends to come out of a silence and an intensity of solitude, in a sense, to be able to articulate, to create your vision. Because solitude has its downside. It has loneliness. When I talk to younger artists, the thing that I hear them say more often than not is that they feel invisible. They feel marginal. They don't know, how to, in a sense, I'm not even sure how to click on this thing. Is that what I'm doing? Aha. Okay, good. And this thing, kind of solitude, this isolation, this feeling of marginality, has tremendous psychic costs. I have one book on display here because I didn't realize we were supposed to bring anything. It's a book that came out really this week, and it's dedicated to a man named Scott Timberg, a very fine arts journalist who killed himself, 2 years ago this week. The burdens of, in a sense, trying to make a real life and a real world as an artist or an arts commentator is very severe. And I'll give you simply, one possible example. It's probably a writer that many of you know. His name was Weldon Keys. He, in fact, jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, which you can see from behind this museum in 1955, feeling not without some reason that despite an extraordinarily distinguished career, he was invisible to society. His life had been a failure. Now, I happened to come across his work in 1976, almost by accident. It was not a name I recognized, and when I read him, to quote Thomas Mann, I read as one does only once or twice in one's life. I read a substantial number of his poems in one sitting, and he was the writer that I needed to read at that instant in my life. And I recognized him not only in a sense as a kindred spirit, but as one of the finest American poets of the 20th century. Now, that opinion wasn't unique to me, but it probably was not held by more than 4 or 5 people in the world at that point. His work was entirely out of print. Much of it had never been published. And so for the next few years, I spent a great deal of time tracking down things of his, and I was determined that someone should write a serious essay on his work. No one had ever written anything but a couple of occasional reviews or an obituary for him. So in 1979, I convinced my brother, Ted Gioia, who's you might know as a very well-known jazz critic now, to put together an issue of the Stanford magazine devoted to Weldon Keys. It was an entirely quixotic gesture. I had spent years on the essay. It was published in a magazine which I put here that it had a circulation of 1,000, which I think was the press run. What its real circulation was is anyone's guess. But it was a magazine that had almost no readership. And I mention that because this is the storyline that I'm going to take through my lifetime of collaboration with book artists. I wrote this essay, which has been reprinted and translated many times now. I have never, in the entire course of its existence, made a single cent off this essay. In fact, it cost me money because I had to buy things and track things down, et cetera, et cetera. but it set off a chain of events in my life that I want to talk about. Now, for those of you who may not know Weldon Keys, he does have a link to San Francisco above and beyond the fact that he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. His first book was published by Jane Grabhorn at Colt Press, and his last book was the first real book printed by Adrian Wilson. And those are the two. He only had one book, The Fall of the Magicians, that was a commercial book. So this thing came out. I had a sense that no one read this magazine. I was working in a day job in New York, and I got a letter from a man named Harry Duncan, and which came out of the blue. And I recognized Harry Duncan because I had read the original edition of Wallace Stevens's Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. And I recognized that Harry Duncan was a fellow that had run the Cummington Press. And so Duncan wrote me a letter saying that he had read this magazine. How he got it, I really don't know. And he was so moved by this short story by Keys that I had found and republished there, that he asked if I would do an edition of Weldon Keys's short stories for the what was now called, and I love this name, Abattoir Editions, because when he had moved the Cummington Press to Omaha, they found an old slaughterhouse, and so an Abattoir Editions. So here I am, an unknown poet, working a day job. At this point in my life, I was not publishing at all. I decided I simply wanted to focus on writing, and I would worry about publishing later. And this eminent figure offered to publish a first book for me. It filled me with joy and hope. So what Harry Duncan gave me was the gift of recognition, in a sense, that he had recognized me as a writer. The book didn't exist, but somehow that, just the letter from him, the notion that this fellow wanted to publish something that I would edit, not something I even wrote, gave me, in a sense, a bridge from my own isolation. So what Harry gave me was not my first book, but the idea that I would have a first book. It was, as it proved, not going to be my first book, because I was in New York. I bumped into two guys at a party, Ken Botnick and Steve Miller, and they had seen a couple of my poems. They had already started an institution called Red Osier Press, but they had gotten a job at the Center for Book Arts in the Bowery, and they needed a project for their students, and they asked, would I be willing to give them these poems? I mean, I don't even know why you even bother to ask a young poet, because the answer will, of course, be yes. And so in about, say, 3 or 4 weeks later, my first book appeared. Now, this was not the idea of a first book. This was actually a first book, but only just barely. They published only 70 copies, and we had a reading, and it was very inexpensively priced, and by the end of the reading, they had sold every copy. So my book had been in print for, 45 minutes. Luckily I bought a couple of extra copies because it's impossible to find otherwise. So I had now, for the first time, in a sense of collaboration. I felt, in a sense, that I was part of a community, and they were delighted when they heard that Harry Duncan was going to do a book of mine too, because that was the community to which they belonged. And this publication also gave me a lifelong friend. At the reading, a large, menacing man with a shaved head covered by tattoos, which was less usual in 1982, sat and looked at me with intense, almost preternatural attention. I assumed he was high on something because we were right in the middle of the drug zone of the Bowery. But afterwards, he introduced himself, and his name was Thomas Dish, one of the great science fiction writers and a really fine poet. We went out for drinks, and we became lifelong friends. And so, without intending to, Steve Miller and Ken Botnick gave me a great artist as a friend. At the same time, shortly thereafter, I got another letter from a guy named Kim Merker at Windover Press in Iowa City. Kim Merker, as a graduate student, had taken on, with a fellow named Reuben Miller, the task of printing the manuscript of a dead poet named Weldon Keys. Had done this in 1961. They had not understood how hard it would be to set everything in hand type. So when they actually printed their own copies of the collected poems of Weldon Keys, they printed the title page in their own blood. And I think that would be the ultimate Keys collectible, the one. And Kim had said that he wanted to do a book of my poetry too, which once again came unbidden out of the blue because he had read the poems when they appeared in the Hudson Review. And shortly thereafter came a little book of 6 poems called Daily Horoscope, which is a title I ultimately used for my first trade book. And now I actually had a book that was printed in an edition larger than 70, and so there was a sense of once again, that this community, which was not the community of poets, it was not the MFA poetry community, it was not the creative writing community, it was not the New York literary world, but these were working artists who were making, hand-printed books, who had felt an affinity for my work and had invited me, in a sense, to collaborate with them. Now, once again, Weldon Keys is the ghost who was animating this. Now, at this point, I had begun publishing much more, and I was much more visible, and I was still waiting for my first book to come out, which is to say the book that Harry Duncan was promising, but something else happened too. I had been corresponding with a poet whom I never met. He's completely forgotten right now. In fact, I just published a book in which the last chapter was about him, and it took me months to find a photograph of him. There's only one photograph that seems to be available. Even when he left his papers to the University of Miami, all of the photographs were removed. And I'd written a little memoir about being about to meet this fellow who died the day before we were supposed to meet. Made a small, it was a small, sad story about artists, poets meeting through the mail. And I sent this to Harry Duncan because he asked what I had been publishing, so I sent a copy, only a very short thing. And literally, by return mail, I got the proofs of the first page of a book called Letter to the Bahamas. Harry Duncan had known Ronald Perry. I think they might have been lovers, back in the 50s. And he printed this enormous oversized folio, which took a poem that I had written about Ronald Perry and put it in the middle, and then surrounded on each page a stanza of the poem with this prose memoir. So I still didn't have Harry's first book, but now I had a second book. And this book is extraordinarily beautiful. And the last page, since the prose is slightly longer than the prose, is simply an empty space, which has a chilling effect when you're reading the book. because of that, this little prose piece that, honest to God, I think 10 years later, because I was publishing a lot at that point, I would have forgotten I had written, always stayed in my mind. And this book, in this weird way, reached people I didn't know, but who knew Perry, who over the years began sending me things, letters by Perry, books by Perry. And I found myself, as I was linked to the ghost of Weldon Keys, now linked to the ghost of Ronald Perry. And isn't that, in a sense, one of the purposes of literature? You know, literature which delights us, which educates us, which instructs us, also has a function to commemorate, to console us, to remember those we've lost. And so I was linked to this, and I only, in a sense, paid off that ghost earlier this year when I published a book of memoirs called Studying with Miss Bishop in this case being my teacher Elizabeth Bishop, in which the last chapter is about this poet that no one has ever heard of, that I never met, who in a sense has taught me things about life and about friendship. Now, I had just gotten married. One of the great fruits of that marriage, my son Ted is somewhere in the audience here, who is going to be hosting us at the Aryan Press this afternoon. I got a phone call in my kitchen from a guy named Michael Pike, who said, "I hear you're interested in Weldon Keys." And I said, "Yes." So we talked for about 2 hours on the phone, and then he told me that he was going to start a press. He'd been studying letterpress, and he asked once again the completely unnecessary question, which is, would you give me a poem? And of course, any young poet will have a manuscript at the ready. So I gave him 2 poems. They are, and this is Mike Pike, who is a giant of a man. The press is diminutive with him, and he was starting Aurelia Press, and he published this elegant book. My own poems are not, I think, contemptible, but they're modest in their merits. But this phone call, animated by the spirit of a dead poet, which I took in my kitchen from a stranger, and I never forget St. Paul's advice that we, must be welcoming to strangers, because sometimes we entertain angels unaware. And indeed, Mike Pike became a kind of angel in my life. He created Aurelia Press, not as an artist's press in the way that perhaps we're thinking of today, but as a press which would champion young poets. And he's done dozens of first books, and has also just done, probably, I think there's almost 30 items that he and I have done together. I would have shown you a better slide, but I gave all my copies to the Huntington Library, so I didn't. This is only what I sort of had on hand. But something else came out of this as we met these young poets, and we talked to them. We understood that there was a whole constituency of writers who, in a sense, fashion had marginalized, which is to say, writers who wanted to write in rhyme, meter, and narrative. There was no place in the United States where they could, in a sense, gather, where they could learn technique. And so without a budget, without any, really institutional support, without a staff, we decided just to have a gathering and offer classes in craft. Nobody was writing. We didn't have any creative writing classes. We had a class in blank verse, a class in rhyme, a class in the sonnet, a class in the narrative. And we created the Westchester Writers Conference, which within 4 years became the largest all poetry conference in the United States. Already one of the things that made this unusual was that this was a conference exploring form and narrative at a period when those things were unfashionable, to say the least. but we also made music, which is to say words and music, song, opera, jazz, song, and things like this, part of the program every year, and we made the book arts part of the program. And we became, in a sense, an internationally significant community. And it went on for 21 years. Mike retired, I left, and our successors, was afraid to be different. He says, this conference is so different. Let's make it more like the other 2,500 conferences in the United States. After 3 or 4 years of being the same as everybody else, it went out of business. So don't be afraid of being different, because there are a lot of people who are probably different in the same way. There are a lot of people who, like so many artists, are searching for a community, searching for a place where they can, in a sense, explore the things that interest them. Now, finally, my first book arrived. I think it was, by that time it was number 6 or 7 book, the Selected Short Stories of Weldon Keys, The Ceremony and Other Stories. The frontispiece is one of Weldon Keys's drawings. He was an extraordinary visual artist, as well as a poet, a fiction writer, a filmmaker. And this is a book, and I can't emphasize this enough, this is a book that I would never have edited if someone hadn't asked me. It was so, when it came out, I got a phone call from a guy named Scott Walker, who had started a press. He was a letterpress printer in Port Townsend, Washington. He'd started a press called Gray Wolf Press. And he says, could you take this book? He says, I see there were stories you left out, and expand it for me. And so at the same time, another person came to me from a New York press, a very well-known press, and said, these editors want to do a trade edition of your Weldon Keys short stories. And so I had an unknown guy in Port Townsend, and I had this rather good press in New York. And I did something that my friends thought I was nuts. I said, I really like Scott Walker's values. This is a guy that's doing it out of love for the right reasons. And so I gave it to Scott Walker, and my New York friends just rolled their eyes like this. We thought Gioia was stupid to begin with, but this is the proof. It came out, the New York Times chose it as one of the best books of the year. And it was reviewed everywhere. I don't think I've ever, took me years to ever get a book with this kind of coverage. So, sometimes the wrong choice is the right choice. Sometimes the choice that you're going on your instincts. I have now been a Gray Wolf author for 40 years. And so, it's now a major press. And, I was there at the beginning. And so it was a sense that, once again, other people were attracted by the values of the press in the same way that I was. At this time, a very interesting, slightly snarky review appeared in fine print. And it began, "Who is Dana Gioia?" And it just said, why are these people doing it? And it was written by a fellow named Gabriel Richard Rummans. And if you know Gabriel, he is the most exciting fine press printer I've ever worked with, because there's never a dull or a calm moment when you're in his company. He creates drama everywhere he goes. And he followed the review by asking if he could print something of mine. And he printed something which is a book of just really sublime beauty. This is something also the strangest memoir in the history of letterpress printing, Fantasies and Hard Knocks. It is a biography or an autobiography the size of a phone book, which is 1/3 is an account of his printing life, 1/3 an account of his sex life, and 1/3 recipes. And so he printed this beautiful book, Journeys in Sunlight, And he had etchings by an Italian artist named Fulvio Testa. And so Gabrielle not only gave me the gift of this beautiful, beautiful book, which I would not have been able to afford on my salary at that point, but he brought into my life this artist named Fulvio Testa, who became a friend, but he became something more important than a friend to me. Fulvio was a pure artist. He was somebody who lived with a dedication in terms of the life of the imagination and of creation. And I found that every time in my life that I was able to spend time with him, every time I saw him, there was a moment of clarification about my own artistic vocation, with him. This is when when Fulvio still had a little hair and I was thin in Verona. And I've done many collaborations with Fulvio, since then. This is an edition of translations I did of the Italian poet Mario Luzzi. And the same way that I've done other projects with Gabrielle. This is this short essay I wrote called On Being a California Poet. One of the things that Gabrielle had a gift for, and you can see it in a sense with Fulvio, is he attracted other people of talent. And so there was all these interesting people that were coming in and out of his workshop and his life, sometimes as collaborators, sometimes as friends. And one of them was a remarkable young woman named Linda Sampson Taylor. I met her when I went down to Alabama, Tuscaloosa, which like the old, it always reminds me of Groucho Marx's joke about Tuscaloosa. And she was a graduate student there, and she had done as a graduate project one of the two most remarkable books I've ever seen come out of a graduate program. The other one is Richard Biggis's version of Neruda's Ode to Topography. And this was called The Myth of Callisto. And when I saw it, it was simply breathtaking. And she then moved to Italy, and she wrote me and asked if I might want to collaborate with her, and in a book that was bilingual. And at that point, I had met a fellow with a wonderful name, Massimo Bacigalupo, who is an Italian scholar and translator of American poetry. He's translated Pound, he's translated Wallace Stevens. His father, in fact, was the doctor in Rapallo, Italy, that Pound used to go to. And actually, Robert Lowell's mother died in his clinic, although Massimo assured me it wasn't his father's fault. But if you know Robert Lowell's poems about Rapallo, actually, Massimo's father appears in there. So suddenly, I'm now, in a sense, for the first time in my life, having my work translated. And it was an extremely interesting experience, a very beautiful book that came out with artwork by Linda. But what Linda really gave me, I think, was not this extraordinary gift of the book, of the collaboration across languages, but my real understanding of how difficult it was for young people to make a career in book arts. The sacrifices they had to make, the poverty that they endured, the moving from place to place, in a sense, trying to find a position. And I think the real dedication, that was required, because, it's only been, quite recently and rather spottily that there's actually institutional support for this. Linda is now, has a position in Kansas, and she's running a graduate program, but it took her many years to get that. Now, community, though, in a personal sense, goes beyond, I think, these things we're talking about in a professional sense or whatever. The central sorrow of my adult life was when my wife and I lost our first son. No parents are prepared for this, and we certainly weren't. And I was really plunged into a kind of despair. I stopped writing for a year, and it was a very difficult time. Curiously, these people I knew through fine press work were people who came forward and really took care of me. A lot of it was just through phone calls and visits and things like that, but it was also through books. Michael Pike printed a series of poems that were, occasioned by my son's death in this large kind of small folio book called Planting a Sequoia. The drawing is by Fulvio Testa. And they even printed the words that I said at my son's funeral as a book that's, privately printed, never really been given to anybody outside the family. But those gestures have an enormous importance to someone who is in a situation such as the one that my wife and I were in. So it was, in a sense, helping me across a chasm in my life. Now, I've done, many other fine press collaborations, but I wanted to close with two very special ones. Jonathan Clark, whom I had met at a couple of places, wanted to do a book with me, but he suggested that we might do a prose book. And so I took a piece that I had written about my childhood reading, which was very unusual. I had a happy, lonely, book-filled childhood. I was raised in a house where there were no children's books, but we had inherited the books of my dead uncle, Fyodor Ortiz. He was a Mexican-American merchant marine who had been killed in a plane crash. And he was an intellectual. He was at one point the secretary of the Communist Party of California. So it was kind of a working class intellectuals library in 4 languages. And so I was raised with these books that, didn't belong in a working class house. And they were transformative. And I talked about them. I talked about the importance that the public library had in my life. And Jonathan and Clark and Kay Bradner did this book. It surprised me. I had no idea that it was going to be, I asked Jonathan for a picture, and this is Jonathan before I met him. It does. It actually looks like Scott Walker of Grey Wolf Press. But anyway, I was delighted to get it because, it's always interesting to see photographs of your friends before you meet them. And they created a book called Lonely Impulse of Delight. And it has these illustrations that they actually, I don't know if they got them, I don't remember sending them. Maybe my wife sent them. These photographs of Hawthorne, where I was raised, of my childhood, these images from the books I was reading. If you look here, you'll see some of the figures from Edgar Rice Burroughs novels hovering around on wings or flying saucers. And there was even, towards the end papers, a picture of me as a child, reading a book. And it's a beautiful book. And once again, as we saw through publication, I understood that this was the beginning rather than the end of the story. And this became the beginning of the book that ends with Ronald Perry, which is called Studying with Miss Bishop, which is the finest prose book I've ever written. It took 30 years, in a sense, for the pieces to assemble and then recombine themselves. But I don't think, once again, I would have thought of it in those terms without Jonathan and without Harry bringing them. And then, at another hard moment, when my mother died, my mother was a tough woman who had to be ferocious to have survived the kind of brutal poverty and literally violence of her childhood. But she hated the notion that I was writing poetry in general, but about her in particular. So she made me promise on her deathbed that I would not write a poem about her. I would not write an elegy. So I had to write an elegy which didn't mention her anywhere, and which is called Sea Pebbles. And Jonathan wanted to do a broadside, and he asked, if I had anything. I said, well, I've got this very, very odd poem, and he says, I have the paper for it. And once again, in a matter of really of weeks, this huge, beautiful book, or it's really a broadside in a folder arrived called Sea Pebbles. So, Jonathan, in a sense, helped me commemorate my mother, despite her wishes, but she did remain unmentioned. Then I had another interesting example. It's the one time since the Weldon Keys issue in 1979 that I collaborated with my brother Ted. I used to be the famous Gioia. Now my brother Ted is the famous Gioia. He's the best-selling jazz and blues writer in the world. If you look at the top 10 best-selling books about jazz or blues at any moment, he usually has 4 or 5 of them. And he's, once again, a pure, devoted kind of scholar enthusiast. And Richard Wagner had come across these wonderful engravings by James Todd and didn't know how to frame them. So he asked if Ted would write an essay about the experience of hearing live jazz, and if I would write a poem about jazz. He was not, in this case, the artist, but he was the impresario, and they created this absolutely sensational book called Trading Eights, which was fun for me because it was fun just to have a book with my brother. And I don't know if you've seen this. I think only 70 copies or 60 copies were printed. It was very expensive, and it sold out before publication. In fact, I think Richard had to sell his own copy to the Library of Congress so that the Library of Congress had a copy. It has these wonderful separation sheets that, I forgot what they're called. These sort of waxed papers that you put by prints, and you turn it over and reveal the print. But it's like looking at these musicians through a smoky nightclub. And in fact, Richard and even has a poem by me, which will be the title poem of my next book. It's called Meet Me at the Lighthouse, which is this wonderful jazz club, which you may know if you've seen La La Land. It has 3 scenes in the lighthouse. Now, I want to end with a family book, which once again was another kind of wonderful chance meeting. Is it Norman Clayton, who is a commercial letterpress printer in Ojai, California. Most of his work is work just to make a living, and he loves, in a sense, these more artistic or more intellectual projects that he occasionally gets with the Book Club of California. And he had done, just out of his own interest, a broadside of a poem of mine, which I didn't even know was being done until he brought it one night to the Zamorano Club. And we began talking, and he said he wanted to do, if we could, a book of mine. So now I've got to go back to when I'm 10 years old. When I'm 10 years old, I am visiting my Mexican grandfather, who is a hard-living alcoholic and a smart, tough guy. And he says, "What grade are you in?" And I said, 4th. And he told me that, he had quit school at 4th grade, which didn't surprise me because I knew that neither of my grandfathers had gone beyond 4th grade. In fact, my Sicilian grandmother was illiterate. She couldn't even sign her own name. And so had to make conversation with him because I was alone with him for a few minutes. And I said, well, why did you quit school? And he told me something I didn't know. He says, well, when my father got killed in a barroom gunfight, I became a cowboy. And then I began to learn this part of my Mexican family's heritage that I didn't really know about. This is my great-grandfather, Juan Jesus Ortiz. He was a vaquero. This is the only surviving portrait of him, and it's actually part of a moldy, rotted wedding photo in which almost all of it was destroyed, but his face came intact. So this is his wedding photo. And he was killed in a barroom gunfight in Lost Cabin, Wyoming, at the beginning of the 20th century. And both of his sons then, had become like he was, a vaquero, and one of them ended up in Los Angeles eventually, who was my grandfather. And I'd wanted to write about this for years, and through a series of circumstances that I won't get into right now, but once again, through the generosity of somebody who didn't like me. I guess I should mention it. I was in Wyoming talking to the cultural organizations there as NEA chairman, and you need an opener for your talk, and I said that I was the last member of my family who had come to this part of Wyoming had been shot and murdered. And I told a little bit of the story, and afterwards this very stern older woman came up to me and cross-examined me. She clearly thought I was making it up. And finally when she left, I asked somebody, who the hell was that? And they said, well, that's the state librarian. About 3 months later, she sent me documents about his murder, the search for the murderer, the trial, and the executions. And out of that, I had to, I wanted to write a poem, and I wrote something that I didn't know what to do with. It was a cowboy ballad. Now, cowboy ballads are not what poets write nowadays, so I didn't publish it. And a BBC producer was visiting me about doing a show, and he asked me what I had, and I said, well, yeah, I got these things. And I said, oh, I got something I'm not publishing, but you might think it's fun. And he says, I love this. He says, I want to do a show about it. And once again, I had underestimated, as it were, the interests of the audience. I had underestimated those things which we had in common. I wrote it as a ballad because I wanted to write it in a form that the people who I depicted, would have identified with. And this poem has gone on to become one of my most popular poems. Norman Clayton brought it out in this beautiful book called the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz, which is, you can see sort of borrows these sort of Mexican motifs, and it is my only fine press book which has gone into a second printing, because the state speaker of California asked if we would reprint it so he could distribute it at an event he was doing. Norman Clayton and I have just done this book. This is the one book on display here, which is a Psalm and a Lament for Los Angeles, which once again is dedicated to Scott Timberg. One of the many casualties, artistic casualties of our society. And so what I'm really saying was that being open to collaboration, to friendship, to community, to chance, and being motivated in a sense by loving the art, I have been blessed by these books, these friends, and this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. So our next speaker, Phil Zimmerman, let me just introduce him. After Phil's talk, we're going to take a 15, 20-minute intermission and come back with Andre Bradley and Nigel Poor. Philip Zimmerman founded his imprint Space Heater Editions in 1979 and has since published several dozen editions of his mostly photo-based bookworks, with 38 editions currently in print. He'll discuss a recent work, Delirium, a striking evocation of the contagions of 2020, both medical and political, which was selected by the Professional Design Association American Institute of Graphic Arts, AIGA, as one of the 50 best designed books of the year. And that's a big honor. This is a major award. Recently retired as a professor of design at the University of Arizona. He lives in Tucson. That's the bio that appears on our symposium information sheet. But we can add that Phil is a perfectionist and a master craftsman. There is nothing that comes out of his studio that is not impeccable, not only in design and finish, but more importantly in concept, which he devotes at least as much attention to refining as he does to refining the design and production of his books. His books are sophisticated in a way we rarely see, the complete package of an idea superbly wedded to form, as you're about to see. Please welcome one of our greatest book artists, Philip Zimmerman.
So anyway, good afternoon. I'd like to again thank Steve Woodall for inviting me, as well as a thanks to all the other folks here who have made this symposium possible. And I'm very grateful to the tech support here. It's pretty incredible. Like Steve, I've had every possible tech problem when giving talks, and this is really impressive. The fact that it's on YouTube as well as Zoom also is a tech feat that I didn't know was possible. Anyway, during the spring of 2020, after that notorious month of March last year, when the world basically shut down and isolated with the hope that this global emergency would last only a few weeks, I remember wondering how serious and lengthy this pandemic could become. Within the first fortnight, it became clear that this was going to be serious indeed. We started washing our hands constantly, along with our incoming mail and packages, fighting hordes of other newly masked people for toilet paper, pasta, rice, other basic food items. And every time we fearfully went out into the world, we tried to avoid door handles, elevator buttons, and attempted to find enough antiviral hand cleaner to sanitize that dangerous world out there. Within a couple of months came the stories of how bad life had become in many places, and especially in New York City, the first place to bear the full brunt of the virus, and where my two sons and their families lived. They described hearing the constant wail of ambulances, watching the nonstop streams of unmarked refrigerated trucks leaving the nearby hospitals, and every evening at 7 p.m., New Yorkers, like their compatriots in Italy, and New Yorkers were a normally hard-bitten bunch, banged pots and pans from rooftops and windows in thanks to the emergency workers who risked their lives. It was clear that the world was going to be locked up and isolated for a good long time, and I wondered how socially engaged fellow artists would be with this new interior world that we now lived in, and whether confinement would produce rafts of new music and art, and specifically artist books, about the current traumatic predicament we found ourselves in. Initially, I had no idea how to address this pandemic in my creative art. However, in April, I started to see illustrations online and in the media of newly mapped COVID viruses with its crown of protein spikes. Pharmacy companies, the CDC, the WHO, health agencies like NGOs, WebMD, and so on, around the world started to attempt to explain the mechanics of the virus to an interested public. Many of these illustrations were jewel-like in glowing colors and very beautiful in the same way that an exotic, colorful snake can be. One knows that they're dangerous, yet they're so pretty, and somehow you just cannot tear your eyes away. I started to collect some of these images off the internet whenever I saw one, and soon I was doing Google image searches specifically to find them. And it wasn't long before I had over 150 of them. I edited those down to about 45 ones that seemed outstanding, and I started to do research on how I could somehow transform them into book pages that had a new fair use life of their own, but retained some of their dangerous beauty. I wanted to try using a technique that I had first investigated in grad school at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester in the 1970s. After learning how to make traditional lith film halftones under Keith Smith and Joan Lyons at the VSW Press, I became fascinated with trying to deconstruct process colors and mixing different kinds of halftone screens with these images. These are just a few more of them. I mean, they're pretty amazing, right? They're just so juicy and vivid. They look like candy. So here are a few image details of part of my final thesis project at VSW called Portrait Constructions that I printed in late 1979. I took portraits of a lot of my fellow grad students and some of the faculty and staff at Visual Studies, and then basically tore the images apart and reconstructed them, being fascinated with how the images were made up of the halftone dots and patterns. I'm showing details because the images are very large, and if I just show the whole image, you can't really see what's happening with them, but here you can see. This is a portrait of Keith Smith. You can see, sort of get an idea of what I'm trying to do with some of these images. I also did, since that time, in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, I'd made a number of other books using similar methods. This is civil defense. I'm just showing a few because a lot of my work has to do with halftones and the reconstruction of photographic imagery. This one's Long Story Short, which I co-published with Nexus Press in Atlanta, Georgia. This one is Paradise Lost. Oh, whoops. Go back, just to give you an idea. I've made several other books over the years that investigate the photomechanics of printing and how photographs and content can be interpreted and reinterpreted by how they are reproduced using halftones. Without getting too much into the weeds, here are some basics of how pre-digital images were converted into something that could be printed in letterpress or offset, the two main printing methods of the late 19th century and the 20th and the beginning of the whole 20th century. When I've talked to my students about how you went about converting photographic images into printable media, which is making halftones, none of them can believe how much things have changed with the digital era and Photoshop and so on. This first image on the upper left is a detail of an enlarged glass screen. This was first invented by people like Frederick Ives, who inscribed heavy glass plates, and then light would be projected through it to form the dots of the photograph for reproduction. The lower image on the left is a contact screen, which is basically does the same thing, only it does it on a thin piece of mylar. And it's a lot easier to handle than the heavy glass screens that had inscribed lines in it. There's a good example, and of course, let's see, I'm losing my place a little bit here. Sorry. So anyway, the first light resulted more light through the contact screens formed larger dots, less light formed smaller dots. Of course, the whole process is much more complicated than this. Every screen had a ruling, which is the number of spots or lines per linear inch or centimeter. When you have multiple angles, as in 4-color process like this, one has to angle the colors carefully so that one does not get a moire pattern. Or you can have fun with it and use the moire as a part of the intended design. Aside from normal old-school halftone screens, which were made with just regular rows of dots, you could also buy specialty screens as ruled lines, wavy lines, concentric lines. You can see these were called line conversions in the 70s and 80s. Now you can do all this now digitally, and it's a lot easier. So I just wanted a little background there because this was all done manually and photomechanically. After I left grad school, I was very lucky to also have had 3 masters of print reproduction teach me more about the craft of working this way. The first was Harry Kristen of Kristen Litho Lab in Rochester, then Chuck Gershwin of Open Studio in Rhinebeck, New York, and finally Richard Benson when I was his assistant during a 2-week offset workshop that he taught at the VSW Summer Institute in Rochester. So for 6 or 7 years, I've returned home from my pre-press darkroom every day smelling like fixer or offset plate chemistry. Nothing was more seductive for me than looking at enlarged halftone dots and patterns. To quote Nathan Lyons, the importance of photography is its impact on people's perception of the world, and photomechanical processes allowed one to take apart images and then reassemble them in a new form that, when viewed from a distance, reverted to the perception of a continuous whole. In a nutshell, I loved the idea that in the work that I was about to try to do, I loved the idea that that what I was doing with the images was mirrored in a far more complex and technological way with what the pharmaceutical companies were trying to do during the pandemic in taking apart the virus in order to develop a vaccine. So this gives you a little idea of this image, how this is the original continuous tone illustration. And this is one step. I'm going to show some more in a second, but to give you an idea of how this turns into one of the printers that's used. Each one of these ends up being a process color: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And here's an enlargement, so you can see the patterns that were used. But now, rather than going mechanically with contact screens and lith film, I'm using Photoshop and breaking up the photograph into multi-channels and assigning them a pattern and then converting them back into a CMYK file. I don't want to get too technical, but that's sort of basically the gist of it. Let's see here, sorry, next page. So then the fall of 2020, I started the digital deconstruction of those images of COVID-19 virus forms, splitting the color channels, reassembling them with new digital halftone patterns and colors. The work was now all digital, of course, but I felt fortunate that I had the life experience of working photomechanically in a traditional way, and knowing the old processes helped me to create and inform the new work. So you can see this, for instance, is the magenta printer. So if you see in the next one, you can see all the magenta or red values are now here. I knew that I wanted them to be I knew that I wanted the book to be large with a powerful physical presence. They were sized so that I could print them myself on full sheets of 17 by 24 Mohawk paper on my Epson printer, which I'll show you a little later. Why do it this way? Well, at the time, and this was at the height of the pandemic, at least in our state, Arizona, which was the fall and during the fall of 2020. And printing it myself, binding it myself, producing it myself seemed like the least contagious way and the safest way to do the production in those pre-vaccine days. All the while, I had started to work on a text for the book. In doing research for the text, I looked at historical writings and literature on the many plagues and pandemics that have visited mankind in the past, most recently with the great 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. It turned out that the literature list was very long, from Homer's Iliad, Boccaccio's Decameron, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, Poe's The Mass Death, Camus' The Plague, all the way to contemporary novels like Stephen King's The Stand. Then, by pure happenstance, I stumbled on a paragraph from the 1866 masterpiece Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Towards the end of the book, the protagonist, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, has a feverish dream. The strangely prophetic text is quoted and used as the narrative line in my book. It's only a long paragraph in length, but when I first read it, it hit me like a splash of cold water, that in 1866, a text could be so prescient was startling. I decided to use Raskolnikov's delirious rant as the only text for the book. I thought I would read it now, since it might be hard to read on the screen. I mean, I'm going to show the book in a little bit, but the type is not that large. So here it is. He had dreamed that the whole world was doomed to fall victim to some terrible, as yet unknown and unseen pestilence spreading to Europe from the depths of Asia. Everyone was to perish, except for certain very few chosen ones. Some new trichinae had appeared, microscopic creatures that lodged themselves in men's bodies. But these creatures were spirits endowed with reason and will. Those who received them into themselves immediately became possessed and mad. But never, never had people considered themselves so intelligent and unshakable in the truth as did these infected ones. Never had they thought their judgments, their scientific conclusions, their moral convictions and beliefs more unshakable. Entire settlements, entire cities and nations would be infected and go mad. Everyone became anxious and no one understood anyone else. Each thought the truth was contained in himself alone and suffered looking at others, beat his breast, wept, and wrung his hands. They did not know whom or how to judge, could not agree on what to regard as evil, what is good. They did not know whom to accuse and whom to vindicate. One of the funny things about this text is that it's actually, to me, becoming more and more apt for our experience of the pandemic. Of course, when I first read it, the lines that hit me the most and most powerfully were the lines about he had dreamed that the whole world was doomed to fall victim to some terrible, as yet unknown and unseen pestilence spreading to Europe through the depths of Asia. That seems like such an obvious reference to, Wuhan, and however you want to read it. But what's interesting to me is that the later text has sort of echoes of our time. But the more we've gone on, the more it seems to have a relationship to the political situation now, where you have anti-vaxxers and Trumpers, and it's just, to me, it's like it's getting an even deeper and weirder resonance. So the lines of the text wove through the sequenced viral images that made up the 64 pages of the book. I've had problems embedding video files in PowerPoint documents before, so I'm going to just show the book as still images. It goes by pretty quickly, and this is obviously the cover. I'll go through fairly quickly, and I hope you will be able to come up later and look at the book here on the table, because it is quite a different feeling when you actually, you can feel and touch the physical object. So this is the open cover. This is the paste down sheets. Again, one of the differences in the experience of it is that when you see it here as a full page, you see the texture, but it's not the same as, obviously, books are intimate objects, and when you see the patterns and the halftone, process separations closer up, it has a very different experience than it does here, but I'll continue anyway, just to give you an idea. This is the title page. And I guess you can sort of read the title, the text, but I will just continue through here. I had a sort of interesting experience with rights on these. You know, they're not photographs, they're illustrations, and because you can't take this kind of enlargement. If you've ever seen an actual photomicrograph of a COVID-19 virus with the spikes, they don't look like this. They look like just like smudgy. They're not very impressive. So I had a recent run-in with a rights organization, Reuters, on a photograph that I had significantly changed, but had not bought rights to, but I thought was fair use. So I've actually gone back after printing it and tried to find most of these and bought the rights to them off Shutterstock and iStock. I haven't been able to find all of them, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting sort of side bar on the images, if you've wondered if I had the right. In my opinion, they're changed enough that it would be fair use, but legally you never know. So again, these are all printed as one full sheet and then folded and sewn using a binding method that's called a sewn signature that was developed by Gary Frost. And it takes me about a day to print them, each book, and about a day to bind them, roughly. So you can recognize some of these images from some of the originals that I showed earlier. There's a colophon and then it's sort of an information with the ISBN and so on. I like this image a lot of the two cells kind of separating. And that's the paste down on the back, and then that's the close right there. So anyway, because of the time involved and the fact that I had to do all the binding myself and the edition I knew would have to be small, I also knew that the book would have to be expensive. Just the archival ink for each book came to about $175 a book, which is kind of astounding. You know, in commercial publishing, if a book costs you more than $4 or $5 a unit, it becomes extremely hard to sell, because the rule of thumb is you have to sell a book for 5 times the unit cost. So if you have, say, a paperback that's $5, you're supposed to sell it for $25. Well, when you have the ink used to manufacture the book at $175 a book, and that's just the ink, not the paper and everything else involved, it becomes a little bit of difficult to have it priced at a more trade-like value, of course. So anyway, I did make only 30 copies. This is my printer. So I spent most of December and a good part of January, February, and March printing and binding. I think it went into April, actually. That's my studio, and there I am binding copies of the book. I don't know if you can make it out because it's a little it's a little ambiguous here, but you can see the gray material. That is a cover stock which is sewn into the text block, but also becomes the actual cover. Another sheet of cardboard goes in within that signature, and then the whole book is trimmed on 3 sides at once, which is really nice to have that. Because, well, you'll see it if you look at the book, but you end up with a book that's just totally flush on all 3 sides. It has a very nice look and feel to it. And of course, this book opens completely flat. And because the cover is not separate from the text block, it's super permanent. It'll never come apart. Most problems with books historically are the text block separates from the cover. Well, here the cover is integral. So it's one of Gary Frost's most amazing things. He's at the Center for Book in Iowa. The one thing is that because of the way it's bound, you have to make a cover that does this thing, it's sometimes called a throw up, where the spine actually moves out. Again, please take a look at the book and you'll see what I'm talking about. And then I made an archival phase box for every copy. And there's an example there, not that that's anything special. I wanted to also talk very briefly about something quite different but related. Just a last quick comment on artists responding to different forms of social engagement, and specifically to the pandemic, which is what I feel like I'm speaking to today, and how it has affected our lives. Early in the pandemic, 2 bookmakers, Katie Garth and Tracy Hahn, created a website called Quarantine Public Library. They invited artists from all over to submit the images for a one-sheet book. A one-sheet book is a piece of paper that's printed only on one side and is folded down to form a little book. They're all free. They're all Creative Commons, so they're rights free. You can print as many as you want, give them away. And I thought it was a really great idea. They already have 185 books in this Quarantine Public Library. To quote their intentions, they wrote, "We love artists' books, zines, and libraries, art and poetry, words and pictures. We wanted to make something to share, as many of us are staying at home, disconnected from art, books, and one another. The project here is not about COVID, but it's explicitly of its time." So this past summer, I made a book for them as part of this Quarantine Public Library called The Masked Cell Towers of Tucson. And again, they're just little 8-page books, and those are all 8 pages. I don't know, I'm sure not many people realize it, but I know you've seen cell towers that are disguised as pine trees. Here you probably don't get many palm trees, but in the LA area, there are a lot of cell towers disguised as palm trees. Anyway, that whole process was invented in Tucson by a company called Larson Company, which was bought out later. But we even have our own saguaro cactus cell towers. And so I just thought it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek mini typology of the concealed cell phone towers, was a funny little reference to the pandemic. And that's it.
Andre Bradley is someone I met when he gave a presentation at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York, about 5 years ago. And I was just kind of blown away by his talk. The book he will share with you, Dark Archives 1 to 41, was shortlisted for the Photo Textbook Award at Les Rencontres de la Photographie and the Paris Photo Aperture Foundation First Photo Book Award, both in 2016. His work is in public and private art collections and libraries, including the Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and Scripps College's Ella Strong Denison Library. Bradley owns MFA degrees from Ithaca College and the Rhode Island School of Design, where he received the T.C. Colley Award for photographic excellence. Andre lives and works in Philadelphia, and when we settled on a theme and title for this symposium, Andre might have been the first artist I thought of. He's an artist I admire so much, and I'm excited to introduce him to many of you, I think probably for the first time. Please welcome a sensitive and insightful photographer and a powerful truth teller whose very personal story demands to be heard. Andre Bradley.
The archival process can happen without you realizing that it has taken place. When I was younger, someone locked me in a basement as punishment. This had a profound effect on the way I deal with disorder, fear, and anxiety. I'm afraid of not being free. When I was younger, I liked the alphabet. My mother would take me to the pediatrician, and the doctor said that I had 20/15 vision. I could always read the tiny letter S. This gave me a command over the alphabet at a young age, and I read. I've come to think of family in archival terms. Family is an institution and an origin point. The members of my family are part of my mother's collection. In this collection, there are photographs, objects, and circumstances. Our home was a site of handling. We are archival contents. No one knows the archival contents of a box from the outside. One's own form hides boxes' belongings. In this state, I sat in my classroom in elementary school, ready to have my contents neglected, to be crammed with knowledge, quote unquote, vital to my education as a Black boy. Myself, a kind of box. I wreaked havoc on myself through isolation, going into the box of my mind. Fighting in the ring of education became a box. Subsequently, I dropped out of school. I sometimes say I left to learn. My family's history is characterized by the relationship between my mother and father. When they separated, a new chapter began in our lives. My family's photographs are deteriorating, but I have them. Now I can keep them safe and in one collection. As a young boy in school, I was taught that there were things worth knowing about, like slavery, like Garrett Morgan inventing the stoplight, like Harriet Tubman showing people the way to freedom. I came to believe that I needed to know what my elders were teaching me, and at the same time, I started to realize I was just filling my box with conventions that would await me once I got older. What once was an empty box had little space left for quiet, but I kept a bit of space free of clutter. I was afraid of the dark, and no book or fact has given me the light needed to vanquish this fear. I learned to hide my trauma. I learned to become a box that could be filled with whatever was needed or wanted. I learned to be a utility for others' ideas or images. A box is a quiet space for storage in a cool, dark place. With education has come an ability to use the tasks of removing clutter, collecting, storing, and archiving to contribute to restructuring the psychology of my mind. I've had to privatize functions of cognition to deal with familial and societal images of success so that I could attend to them productively. I have done this to maintain my sanity and a sense of order. I fall apart, I put myself back together. My relationship with my father is characterized by my memories of him. There's a photograph I can't find of him holding my sister when she was a really small baby. He's in blue pants and a white dress shirt, smiling. He is a happy dad. He looks happy to be holding such a beautiful little girl. The image reminds me of a memory of him leaving out the door. I wonder where he was going, looking fixed and famous. Like a photograph of Michael Jordan, somehow it represents a slam dunk for me. My heart's volume is equal to the distance between Virginia and Pennsylvania, where he lives and where we both grew up. The most limiting image of all is a frame unlike any other. It's a box. What does it mean to look into one, to look like one, or to look like one that's fallen apart? Can a picture survive the cold, dark penitentiary air? Can one see an image stained with blood? The reality of actual human beings in jail or a bullet going through a body holds significant weight against the particular transience of images. Human bodies and minds deteriorate within the confines of a severe justice system. Prison is not a part of my autobiography, but when my stepfather was arrested, we experienced a loss in my home. For the 3 years he was away, I didn't talk to him, I didn't see him, and I wondered where he was. I am like paper. I can be easily torn due to a delicate nature. However weak I am made from hardy stock, like American black walnut. The weight of some papers make them so they could fly away forever and be forgotten. A cardboard box can be trodden into the ground, but wood can support a body. I'm just one black man. I don't trust what I hear about black men in the American media. No one should. If you would ask how some urban African American communities have come to deal with such terrible circumstances, you would begin to unravel and peel back what's really going on, what's happening. How to be good. The how of goodness is hard to figure out. I have my father's name, Andre, Ardib, Duval, Bradley. Decoded, it can mean brave man of the heavenly valley of broad wood. My initials are AB. I'm definitely sure I never learned to read in school. I saw my mother reading and copied her. Alpha, beta, AB, a quiet little alphabet. I have to judge the meanings of words. The word black, for example, creates a rupture in me. The idea of blackness is both limiting to some and limitless to others. Other people's limits create a fracture in my identity. To me, black is quiet and black is change. Time passes. I have become a man and I am black. The meanings of words change, and it is important to know the difference between what they meant in the past and what they mean now. Who I am can only become known over time. I'm angry, I'm sensitive, and I'm intelligent. I'm one short, thin black man. I'm not what others or I imagine me to be. I'm always more. Who am I? Who are we? And who knows why police shoot us? It's like we're already dead. Our city, with its narrow streets and dead ends, has taught me how to navigate narrow spaces of injustice. I'm black, so be careful how you look at me, because I will look back. I bring a pressure to your encounter with the physical, social, and psychological idea of darkness. How will you act toward me? How do you imagine me? I am in your imagination. When you go to define me, it is clear that you cannot. I am not in your frame. I have style, I evade death, and safety is the price we pay for freedom. To look back is a defense and healing. To look up words is one way to understand their meaning. Growing up in Philadelphia, I lived in something like a small town. I've truly been a copy of images from movies or television shows. I've worn oversized clothes and what my friends used to call white boy clothes, but nothing ever feels right. What do I believe I represent in these clothes? I looked out from my house as a little boy for images of men to become. I've been afflicted by American circumstances. My failures define me with such grace and poignancy. When my back is to the wall and I must fight for my life or vulnerability, I desire composure. My relationship with my mother is characterized by her presence. I have memories of her and can continue to create more. I still travel to see her. All things came from her. She created my world. Without her, I would have lacked context. I'm a document within her archive. She taught me how to write, and together we wrote on the page. Growing up, I remember there being 5 of us in the house. It is an odd but strong number. My mother left my dad, but I came of age while my mother was dating Jerry, who was always around for us. When he was arrested, I was in 6th grade. Then there were only 4 of us in the house. 4 is an even and rigid number. I'm obsessed with Michael Jordan. Jerry came from 0 and made us the odd, complete number of 5. I'm obsessed with Michael Jordan, too, because the sum of his jersey number is 5. There was a light that illuminated the alleyway in my backyard home. It's labeled number 5. The sum of my birthday is also the number 5. When I'm afraid, I begin to dissociate from the pain that experiencing that fear makes me feel emotionally. This always drives me to collect in one way or another. Images, books, ideas, clothes, sneakers, or the memories I associate with the fear. Books are comforting because they provide an instant order. When I read books, I can escape my own disorder. I believe I'm making sure that the contents of my box are organized. Regardless, there's always unchecked information, and there's always images. There are always images too dark to be seen. I cannot store those. They create a disorder and disrupt my actions. I'm Black, so that's what I recognize out in the world. I point to things that express as objects a sort of stoic or valiant grain, a suffering that, unless viewed with a generous and lingering eye, can go unnoticed. How is my family judged by society? We are judged to be disadvantaged Americans. Is it our fault that we have been forced to survive American circumstances? I have resolved the problem caused by the presupposed worthlessness of Black images by presenting them to the viewer in ways that express the traumatic psychic effects of being viewed as bad and being treated badly in a larger social context. How to be Andre Bradley, how to be A, B, or C. How to be different from what my fellow countrymen expect me to be. What does it mean to organize from A to Z? Is that everything? I remember my father coming to visit my brother and me. We walked from 46th Street near the VA Medical Hospital to Marion Anderson Gym. I remember walking from West Philadelphia to South Philadelphia. I know my brother didn't like the walk. We came to a playground, and my brother and I played with my father. He talked to someone on the other side of a fence. He left us for what seemed like a minute and a long time. I remember the texture of the empty swimming pool floor. The day is strange in my memory because no other children were around. We went to the gym and watched the boxers. No one was boxing that day. We sat in the lobby, and I remember my father telling us that he used to sleep in the gym sometimes, like when you don't have a house. We might have looked around the gym, stood in the ring, and touched the ropes. Then my dad walked us home. It would be one of the last times he traveled to see us. My brother would buy boxing gloves every summer. He would sign them in his illegible handwriting. Every summer, he would show his expertise. My father had taught him to box, and he honed his skills on the faces and heads of other black boys. Now he buys them for his sons. My father always left and came back. He lived in Virginia, close to his mother, who took care of him. Before long, my father's indifference showed. He stopped traveling to see us. Travel has a way of wearing down the body. Underexposure, photography, inadequate exposure to light, an underexposed negative print or transparency, insufficient attention or publicity. Most people are afraid of the dark or afraid of the unknown. Some people don't like or understand the qualities of underexposed images, how they teach from a failure of illumination, how they teach from their display of darkness. When I was younger, I loved to sing. I remember these children on the Mickey Mouse Club sang songs to the world. The Tanners, the family on Full House, had 3 men in their house and a dog that wasn't a pit bull. Around the television in my childhood room, there was a small broken TV stand made of wood chips, and it was covered in some wood-like veneer. My brother's clothes and my clothes were everywhere, dirty socks, toy trucks, and broken toys. In my youngest days, I watched white families on TV and wondered about my own. I'm a humble writing system, and I collect what I record. My personal record and my public image show me who I am. Neither of these can be found in books. I use the alphabet to tell my story. My initials make me who I am. Andre Bradley. A box could be a prison, it could be a school, it could be your idea of me. The space inside similar places, like the American classroom or American prison cells used for solitary confinement, reminds me of my small childhood room, the middle room. It reminds me of yellow wallpaper. Searching for examples, images of good black men to become drove me away from my family. Out in the world, none of these images or representations show me who I am. I have my own family photographs to zoom in on. So that's the end of the slideshow. Dark Archives. This work I made in 2015. I just want to pose some questions related to the statement that I made for it at the time. Dark Archives by artist Andre Bradley is a provocative exploration of one black man's memories of childhood. I want to pose the question, what does it mean to provoke empathy? And why was I desperate for empathy at the time? An autobiography in fragments, Dark Archives interweaves Bradley's writing and photographs with pictures from his family's archive. Not only was the autobiography in pieces, I also was at the time that I made this. What pulls me or Black people apart generally? How do I and other Black people become aware of, resist, and resolve fragmentation? Part story, part lyrical investigation, Dark Archives aims to upset the linguistic and visual constrictions placed on Black males. When I was growing up, I was shut off from emotion by gender and racial stereotypes. Making this work began with a repressed memory of trauma and has been followed by years of healing and learning about adverse childhood experiences. Bradley powerfully combines image and text in this deeply moving meditation on narrative agency, on the family as archive, on being a young Black man, and on being Andre Bradley. Narrative memory is not always completely correct. What have I embellished? How does photography fix and fictionalize a character? What's next for the narrative agent? How does the agent continue speaking in ways that are secure and confident? How does image and text in the book continue to be a vehicle through which I can answer these questions in ways that are psychologically safe, uncompromising, and enduring? Thank you.
Okay, and our last speaker today is someone I've known for, I don't know, like 15 years, I guess, Nigel. And I'm fond of saying that, quote, famous book artist is the ultimate oxymoron. But I have to say that in the past few years, our next speaker has gained a measure of well-deserved fame, and a large following beyond that of any other artist I know personally who makes books. And even though books per se haven't been primary in her work, documentation is. And I've always seen all of her artistic activity as book-like. Now that includes her collaborative work at San Quentin Prison, where she, her broadcast partner, Erlon Woods, and all those who have told their stories from that place have worked together to create a podcast called Ear Hustle, which has gained a large international audience, and was last year, it was actually shortlisted for a Pulitzer Prize. Ear Hustle episodes are by turns heartbreaking, startlingly funny, and true. Taken together, the Ear Hustle episodes are like a very thick 19th century novel, I think of Charles Dickens, that weaves together scores of characters with their individual stories told in great detail to deliver an epic vision of a particular time and place in a world under lock and key. The whole thing began when Nigel volunteered to teach a class about photography, but let's let her tell you about that. Please welcome a famous book artist, Nigel Poor.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the work I do at San Quentin State Prison, which is all about storytelling and collaborating with incarcerated people to bring out stories about life inside. But I want to give just a little background into how I got there. So I'm a photographer, I'm a professor of photography, and that's the work that got me into prison. I started going in 2011 through an organization called the Prison University Project. And I went in to teach a history of photography class. And I was really excited about it because I feel like photography is the perfect tool or bridge for conversation, because photographs are inherently about communication, but they also help trigger and populate our memory. The image encompassed within the frame reveals its own narrative, and it can be as complicated as any conversation because it has story, plot, character, and subtext. And part of its power is its capacity to mean something a little bit different to each person who looks at it. So I believe that recollection and reverie and meandering through one's own history and bringing back stories to share with others is an essential human impulse. And it's a way of saying that I'm here, I matter, and I need to be heard. But memory is a jumbled and chaotic thing, and it can be really difficult to assemble in a way that allows access for others. So a photograph can work both as a prompt and help anchor recollection while allowing the viewer of the photograph to kind of drift back into their own experience and find a story they want to share. So those are all the thoughts I brought into San Quentin when I was thinking about how to teach a history of photography class. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the assignments that I did with the class, because all of this filters into all the work basically I do inside the prison. So in the class, it was a history of photography class, but I really wanted the men inside to learn about how to make a photograph, but I wasn't allowed to bring cameras in. So I came up with a couple of different assignments, and one of them was called the verbal photograph. And the idea was to ask the men in the class to kind of dredge up and recount an important memory that they didn't have a photograph of. And by using photographic concepts like perspective and point of view and scale and color versus black and white, I wanted them to create that memory through words. So I just wanted to share an example of one of them. This was done by Marvin. And if you read some of the language, it's very invitational. He escorts us through his memory by saying things like, if you look behind the light bulb, you will see. If you turn your attention to the woman, you'll see this. Just like a photograph does. A photograph is a visual invitation to understand something, and the verbal photograph was a written invitation. And he ends by something that I find so very emotional. At the end, he says, I should say this memory is about his mother. And he says, this memory means so much to me because it's what I perceive to be the earliest memory of my mother. And I love this because it speaks to how unstable a memory can be. He's not even sure if this is an actual memory, but it doesn't really matter because he wanted it to be. He brought it into being by the way he expressed it. So whenever I think about photographs, whenever I think about any art making and truth telling, I always like to think about how almost any truth is desire and memory and experience all coming together to make something that we need. And it doesn't always matter if it's the truth or not. And when I talk about that, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about alternative facts. I'm talking about something that's much more esoteric, which is the stories that we need to understand our lives and the lives of other people. This was another assignment that I had with the students. I printed out photographs by well-known artists. This one's by William Eggleston, and I printed it on both sides of the paper. And the guys were able to take these back to their housing unit and live with them for a couple weeks. And what I asked them to do was, on the first side, was to map the image. which was to look at it and write on it and bring out all kind of the clues that they saw, which would help them understand the photograph. I intentionally didn't give them a lot of information about the artist. I just told them the name of the artist and the date, and then it was completely up to them to find the meaning in that photograph. And this student was so sure that this was a gas station from where he grew up in Los Angeles. And it didn't matter what I told him, that it was not in Los Angeles. And again, I love that because it spoke to the way photography can connect with an individual and they can find themselves in it. And so the top part is what I call the mapping. And the image underneath is where he wrote his narrative based on the mapping. And so the story he wrote has this very complicated family tree, which you can see drawn on the photograph. So again, another example of finding a personal narrative in a photograph. In 2012, while I was still teaching at San Quentin, I got access to this amazing, I'm not going to call it an archive, a collection of photographs taken at San Quentin between approximately 1938 and 1980. They were all 4x5 negatives, and it was just this jumbled mess. What you're seeing here is after I've tried to turn it into an archive. I started going through these negatives, and there's not a lot of information on them. Some of them are in these sleeves, and you can see there's a date and a little bit of an explanation, but a lot of the photographs are a mystery. Really all I knew about them were that they were taken by correctional officers as a way to document life inside San Quentin. They were kind of moldering away in a closet inside the prison, and I got permission to bring them to my studio and try to archive them and save them because I think they're a really important historic document from a place, a prison where most of us do not have access. So as I started going through the box, every day was constantly amazed by what I would find in there. And my original idea was to try to put them into different categories with my mind's eye on turning it somehow into a book. And I found the images on their own quite amazing, but in some ways so hard to read because I couldn't always tell what was happening inside of them. And I wanted to, and this is a good example of one, some of them had some writing on it, like this one, which the title is Stabbing in a Gym, and it has the date on it. But I wanted to find a way to try to understand these images and collaborate with a group of men inside to help me explain what we were seeing. So what I was seeing as someone, a visitor coming in and out of the prison versus what people who were living there would see. So I used the same idea that I did with the photographs by well-known artists, which was to give the images to the group of men I was working with. They would take them back to their housing unit and write on them and bring out what they saw in the photograph. So they became, again, the escort into the image to explain something that I may have missed or other people would have missed. So this is an example of one of them that I always love to share, and this is by one of my students, Reuben Ramirez. And this is a pretty brutal image. Obviously, it's called Stabbing in the Gym. It's really difficult to know if this person is alive or not. And Reuben writes, you can see writes on the body, and it's a little bit hard to read, but I want to read one of the things that he says, which is, the arms symbolize buttresses attempting to prevent the structural failure of a once proud cathedral, encouragement and enlightenment versus indifference and authoritative tyranny. And when I saw that, I was so amazed that somebody could look at this photograph and think of it in terms of architecture and also poetic architecture, and think about the body as a cathedral that's struggling to be held up. And so all of a sudden, this image that on first blush is about pain and brutality becomes an image that's full of subtext and someone else's story, talking about this struggle to regain their structural integrity, I guess is a way to talk about it. And so I realized that every image in this archive could have that same kind of complexity if somebody who had experience of incarceration would take the time to look at it and write on it and pull something out to share with us. So that idea of the mapping the photographs became really an essential part of the project. So it was the archival images and then the images that the men wrote on. And Colleen, can I ask you to take a picture of the next image? Thank you. I'll give you a second. So a lot of the men that I worked with inside San Quentin were serving really long sentences, but things have changed a little bit with some of the sentencing laws. So some of the guys are now out, and I'd love to show Reuben, the guy who mapped that image. He also did some other images that are in the book, and he was so proud to be part of it. So this is a photograph of Reuben holding his book, and I just wanted to get a picture so I could share it with him. So thank you, Colleen. This is the book that the project became. I worked on the archive project starting in 2012, and the book came out in 2000 or 2001. Anyway, it was an incredibly long process. So again, in the book, there's the archive images, there are the images that the men worked on, and there's also images from the class. So I just want to show you a few spreads. These are some more examples of the mapped images. So all of this work with the Prison University Project and the archive led directly to the development of the podcast that I co-created inside San Quentin. And they're all of the things that tie this work together, the teaching, the archive work, and the podcast. All these projects are an endeavor to try to get people to think about prison and incarceration in different ways. I don't think that you can change people's minds with statistics. I think the only way you can change people's minds is through showing connection and through looking at details and from finding work that shows you each of us as individuals have revelations and have things to share. So that's the purpose of all of this work. And I'm going to talk with the rest of my time about the podcast. I was very thankful that Steve said, even though it's a podcast, it's book-like, because I admit this is not a book, but I do think of it in those terms. So the podcast, Ear Hustle, is about everyday life in prison. And I know that sounds like it's really heavy and it should be covered by serious journalists, and I'm not one. I'm a visual artist. So when people hear about the podcast, they assume it's going to be really depressing and violent, or it's going to be about people who have been wrongfully convicted and a call to tear down the prison walls. But it's really none of those things. It's a podcast that has a very specific intent, both in the topics it explores and the way we put the podcast together. This is my co-creator, Earlonne Woods, who, when we created this podcast, was still incarcerated at San Quentin. He was a three-striker serving a 31-year to life sentence. So we met in 2012 when I was volunteering inside the prison working in the media lab, and we worked together for a few years on a radio project. And then in 2016, I proposed to him that we start a podcast, and he said yes, which was great. And then the next thing was, well, what's a podcast? So it's one of the things I love about Earlonne. He always says yes first. And, obviously in prison, you don't hear podcasts, right? I mean, there's not internet access. So, but he was up for it. So anyway, we work in a really difficult space. I mean, there's nothing about prison that's easy. Anything you accomplish takes so much time. I mean, you have to have an incredible amount of tenacity, and you have to be very clear about your ideas and your purpose. And you have to learn to work below the radar, because to the prison system, you are not important. And so I want to share with you some of the essential components needed to do this kind of work. And I think these components can be used to apply to any kind of creative endeavor that you're working on. So The first thing I want to talk about is the importance of finding a story that everyone else overlooks, and to think about how small details speak to something much larger. So to illustrate these 3 points that I want to talk about, I'm going to play small clips from the podcast. So the first clip I'm going to play for you is from an episode called Firsts. It's 1 minute and 20 seconds, and it's a conversation. The whole episode is about first experiences in prison, and this particular piece is about somebody's first hug after they'd been in prison for quite some time. So I want to listen to it and then come back and talk about it a little bit. The thing I wanted to talk to you about was your first visit with your mom.
Ooh.
And yeah, how did you prep?
So let me get the emotional prep out of the way. I took a lot of deep breaths. I try to choreograph my hug, because I haven't hugged my mom in a long time, but in the cell. But
Wait, how did you practice? How did you choreograph a hug?
so I didn't know, because I haven't hugged someone in a long time. Maybe by then it was 13 years, right? So I didn't know if my hand goes around her shoulder, or her neck. I didn't know if it went diagonally, like 2 45-degree angles. And then I was like, you know what? I let her lead. Like, this is your mom, right? This is my mom, and I don't know how to hug my mom. So I was nervous about that type of stuff.
Did you actually practice hugging somebody else?
No.
Just like an
I,
air,
my
you did an
celly
air
wasn't
hug?
up for that, no. I did not. I just kind of air hugged myself, and I didn't know exactly, okay, what do you do? Up? Is it down? Is it sideways? So that's what I was nervous about.
He had a lot to be nervous about after 10 years. That's a long time. And this is a longer story. And like Adnan's feelings about his mother, it's also complicated. So one of the reasons I like to use that clip to talk about details is that that a whole story can be based on this idea of a hug. And when I go into an interview, or we go into an interview, we never know what's going to happen. So we always have to be listening very carefully. So when I said to him, I want to talk to you about your mom's first visit, I heard him make that sound. And so I knew right away that there was some deep psychological territory to plumb there. And then when he said he had to choreograph a hug, that was just like an aha moment, because, I mean, who of us in this room has forgotten how to hug somebody? It's such a shocking thing to hear. It's such a human thing that we do all the time without thinking about it. So it was a good example of how a small thing like a hug is a way to talk about the deprivation of prison and what happens when soft touch and loving touch is taken out of your life. Another thing that's really important, I think, in any creative project is to mix emotions, that you have to find the humor and the beauty and the tenderness and the brutality and mix it all together in a way that's appropriate. Because none of our lives are one note. We all experience these things, and we have to make use of it. So I want to play another clip that speaks to this. I mean, all ear hustle stories that you hear will combine all of these emotions. So this is from an episode called Looking Out. And on the surface, it's a story about finding love and giving love in prison. The main character's name is Roach. And so 3 things that you'll hear in this clip are the range of emotions. You'll hear myself and Earlonne Woods, who are the co-hosts, the narrators, that take you in and around the story. And most of that is improv. We don't have a script that we're working off of. And then you'll also hear the sound design, which is another important element for us telling the story. So how does the sound, both music and kind of ambi, help escort you through the experience of hearing the story? So this clip is about 1 minute and 53 seconds. So how would you describe him?
To me, I think Roach looked like the original Jesus Christ. You know, I mean, he got the dreadlocks. He looked like he's from the earth. And if he could, he'd probably just be wearing a leaf. And he got this one little thing that he do. He'll just start sniffing on his dreadlocks.
I know, I've seen him do that. He grabs his hair and he pulls it in front of his nose and just sniffs.
Why are you whispering?
Because I feel like I'm talking about him behind his back. He knows he does it, right?
Yeah.
It's not like he's going to hear this and go, oh my God, I sniffed my hair.
Hey, he'll catch himself, and you just be looking at him, he like,
FYI, I do smell my dreads. I put different oil on each one of them. They smell good. They smell like I just came out the dirt, hanging out with roots and stuff.
But you know what, though? When people from the outside look at Roach, they be like, oh, dude weird, man, I ain't talking to dude. But Roach is a cool dude.
My name is Renell Draper, but I go by Roach. My relationship with people is pretty strained. I don't trust them. From early on, they have been a source of pain for me.
So Roach is about 40 years old, and he's a pretty shy guy.
Until you know him.
When I was a child, before I was removed from the care of my mom's custody, she tried to drown me a couple times in the tub. And then she stopped and she left the bathroom and she was crying. I knew she was unhappy or sad at something I did. I wanted to actually comfort her, but I didn't know how to do it. I don't remember her face, and I haven't seen her since.
Again, that clip expresses the three really important components of our storytelling that my partner Erlon and I are the escorts through the story, helping set up and explain what people are going to hear. They're the varying emotions, so it starts out pretty lightheartedly, talking about Roach, and then Roach comes in and explains something about himself, and then it feels very light and like friends talking, and then there's a shift. You start to hear this water dropping, and there's a couple beats of silence, and then Roach comes back in with the story about what happened to him growing up, and it ends with him saying that he hasn't seen his mother since, and it's not just that he hasn't seen his mother since, he doesn't remember her face. And that's such a complete erasure of somebody's attachment to a person, and so you end gutted. Where you started laughing and thinking, this is kind of fun. It takes you to a really difficult place. And then through the story, we cycle through that again, and it doesn't end in such a dark place. The other thing that's important for any project that you work on is the workaround. No matter what you're doing, whether it's a photograph or a book or writing poetry, working on an archive, you're always going to hit problems, and that's when people want to stop working, but that's when you have to push through. So again, as you can imagine, working in a prison is really difficult, and we encounter so many problems, and the space we work in is very loud. It's a concrete room. There's no soundproofing in there, and of course, making a podcast, silence is an important thing, and we would constantly be getting interrupted. So we decided to just take that and make it part of our experience, make the interruptions in the sound of prison just part of what we do. So these are some images of where we work. So you can see it's a pretty big concrete space. So there was one guy in particular named Lonnie, who was so loud, and whenever we would be recording, he would always bust in. So in our podcast, you hear him all the time, and we just now refer to it as getting Lonnied. So people who listen to the podcast know what that means. But this is a little sound design we ended up using to help explain how we deal with the lack of silence in prison. So this is just 38 seconds long.
Ask us for a favor, they kick us out.
All right, we need quiet now. We're gonna record. Top of the line team, the Raiders, baby. Raider Nation, baby. Yeah.
It's so freaking hard to make it quiet in here.
It's prison.
We gotta turn that fan off
Hey, do you
now.
think it's quiet enough?
It's finna get hot.
Nope, never is.
It's never freaking quiet enough in here, man.
Never quiet. It's prison for you. All right, everybody, we're gonna need some quiet.
Hey, Jazzy.
All right, we're recording.
Hey, can we get about 10 minutes so we can get this line out?
No problem, man.
Hey, look it out.
Hear that?
Thank
you.
Hey, what?
It's finally quiet in here.
Okay, let's do it.
So we used to just play that a lot. The guy who said, Raider Nation, baby, that's Lonnie. That's the guy who Lonnied us. And he's been in prison for 45 years. He got out recently. And we invited him to our studio outside, and he did the same friggin' thing. He still Lonnies us, even though he's out of prison. So along with the podcast, Erlon and I have also, during COVID, wrote a book about the creation of Ear Hustle and sort of behind the scenes and more stories that we weren't able to tell in the podcast. So I want to end with just one more little bit of audio. And this is from a story that we did about life on death row. And death row, California has the death penalty, and everyone who's on death row is housed at San Quentin. There's about 700 guys on death row there. It's a very difficult place to get to. We couldn't visit. We had to do all of our interviews over the phone with 4 different guys who were on death row. And one of the men we talked to was Steve Champion, who's been on death row for over 30 years. And I just want to end by playing a very short clip of Steve Champion. This is just 30 seconds long.
As long as you are alive, there is hope. When you are dead, that struggle is over. You can't look in terms of the future because the future is not yet here. So what do you have left? You have right now. And so that is what you have to live at, right here, right now. That's eternity.
So I would invite you all the makers in this room, all the thinkers in this room, to take Steve Champion's advice about living in the present moment, because as he said, that's eternity. So thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know if you are willing. What I said about Q&A before, maybe some of us might have some questions, and if the presenters don't mind us asking, let's try it. We're going to try it and do it again, tomorrow as part of the broadcast tomorrow. But could we bring the lights up a little bit? And I don't know how this works with YouTube, but because I've got some questions. Would you guys mind coming up front? Thing about later, you couldn't believe how frank and unfiltered your writing was when it all came out. And how are you processing that now? A little bit at the end, I saw with some of that processing. And how does that affect the work you're doing now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think it's, here you can see it, it's safe for me to say that at the time that I made Dark Archives, I had not realized that seems a little stupid, but that a lot of people have adverse childhood experiences that affects the ways that they process information, the ways that they look at the world, the ways that they experience emotion and relationship, attachment. And I had no idea about those things. And being locked in the basement was something that had a profound effect, like I say, but I didn't really understand what those effects were. So in making that work, I was like, whoa, I'm saying this stuff to strangers. It's about something that happened in my family, which is usually in a Black family, never spoken about to strangers. And it's personal, it's private, it's not made public. And making it public was a way to get to what's happening outside of the personal and the private, which is usually political. So in my recent work, I'm using the effects of trauma and using them, let's say, as a literary device, or because I'm looking at areas in the city, I'm attracted to areas in the city that are neglected and interspersed with civic nature, those are the spaces that I'm looking at and using in a way to illuminate the effects of trauma as I'm healing it, as I'm unlearning some of the practices that don't help me in life. And I would say so that I can more willingly, more powerfully wield like isolation and solitude in my artistic practice and being comfortable and confident with that choice. Thanks, that's a great question.
Asked a question about where my interest in jazz began. And I have to say it's a family interest, since my brother Ted is actually the great jazz specialist. I grew up in a house with a Mexican mother and a Sicilian father, and it was a dramatic house. And my parents had operatic arguments, but they also put on records and danced in the kitchen. And so I grew up hearing jazz and, in a sense, seeing, my parents. My father was actually a competition dancer in his youth, and so it was both beautiful in the sense that art is beautiful, but it was also beautiful in the way that art makes people beautiful. And so I think that was my earliest memory. I played the piano, my brother played the piano, we both played in jazz bands. And actually one of the great pleasures of my life was when I came to the NEA as the chairman, and I looked at how little support and recognition the United States had given to jazz artists, and I tend to think that jazz is actually one of the emblematic American arts. And so by expanding that program, by creating national tours, creating programs in high schools, and most important, honoring jazz musicians, both with the Jazz Masters and with the National Medal of Arts, we took and recognized the individual contributions of truly great American artists who would have otherwise had their reputations confined to a subculture. I think actually the pleasure that the previous question was about was the fact that those of us who are part of this subculture of book arts have so few opportunities to gather and to talk about it. So in a weird way, it's a kind of like a family reunion, like a fans meeting. And for me, I had that at the highest levels with the Jazz Masters, where we would bring them together every year. And so it was a real pleasure for me as an adult to get to know so many people whose music I loved as a kid and as a teenager.
Oh, yeah. So I laughed bitterly because I teach at Sac State too, and I love my students. But teaching inside San Quentin was so different because my students were so serious in there. And I had to always be careful when I went back to Sac State to not say, you know what, I never get an excuse from the dudes inside about why they didn't get their homework done. So I'm not sure that's answering your question, but I've taken a lot of what I've learned from teaching in prison. I don't teach in there anymore, but about understanding that you never know what someone's experience is. I never know what my students' experience is at Sac State either, so just being much more open to reading the spoken cues and the non-spoken cues from any student that I work with. And the thing that's been interesting is I talk a lot about the work I do in prison with my students at the university, and I had no idea how many of my students have been impacted by incarceration, either in their immediate family or distant family or friends. And so I found that it was a conversation that a lot of my students were so relieved to be able to have. And that was a bonus I didn't see coming. So yeah, I think that's how it's affected my teaching. I think it's made me a better teacher, I hope. Yeah.
How did the pandemic affect the fact that well, as I mentioned, most of the work was done really, for me, living in southern Arizona, the fall of 2020 was, well, it's actually really bad now, but we didn't have that early rise in cases in the pandemic until, I think it was about Labor Day, and things got really bad in Pima County, which is where I lived. It's actually really bad now again. But so that, as I said a little bit in the talk, being able to do everything myself was actually kind of my saving grace, because this sounds horrible to say, but for me, the pandemic as an introvert was actually pretty good. I don't mean it good, but I mean, I was able to really concentrate on work, and I didn't have to do a lot of social stuff that I don't always like to do. And I always feel kind of guilty saying that, because most people's experiences of the pandemic has been so terrible. And I'm very empathetic of that, but living sort of in a privileged place, retired, it actually was a very productive time for me. And as I said, being able to do everything from beginning to end right there in my studio was actually good. I didn't have a lot of choice in terms of production because so much stuff was shut down. I don't know, is that what you were asking? Okay.
So this is how to tune in tomorrow. Tomorrow we have two wonderful presenters, Clifton Metter, one of the great book artists, and Laura Anderson Barbata, whose story is just phenomenal about working with indigenous people. The Yanomami are way, way back in the Amazon rainforest. It's very difficult to get where they live. And they were making, she had them making paper from the native plants where they live, and then printing on them with kind of pretty primitive, printmaking techniques to create artist books in the Amazon rainforest. It's a phenomenal story, and Cliff is going to talk about a 300-year-old printing temple, Tibetan printing temple, where they are still printing the sutras with the same techniques that they used 300 years ago, and it supports a fairly large community, and it inspired his own work. He'll talk about that. And then we're hoping that at least some of our presenters today will join us at the end of that for a kind of roundtable discussion. I think it's going to be great. This is how you get there. You can search YouTube for Bridges, social engagement, or you can find it also on the Legion of Honor's events page. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for tuning in wherever you are. And we hope to see you online tomorrow. Thanks so much.